On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the United States is going to build a pier for Gaza. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, following the State of the Union address, we see the efforts being put forth by the United States to construct a pier to facilitate the delivery of food and aid into Gaza to provide support for the 2 million Palestinians in the region. Now, this video is not about the political situation between Israel and Gaza, Hamas. It's nothing with that. If you want a video on the background, the politics, what's happening there, plenty of them on YouTube. Go knock yourselves out. This is about the construction of the pier and what this entails, because the President of the United States has allocated this mission to the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense is going to go about constructing what is known as the Joint Logistics Over the Shore operation, something I am very familiar with because I've done it for a few years when I worked with the military. So we're going to break this down, talk about it, and then we're going to see exactly what this means going forward. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out.
Tonight, I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the coast of Gaza that can receive large shipments carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters. No U.S. boots will be on the ground. A temporary pier will enable a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza every day.
So that was the President of the United States at the State of the Union making this announcement. Knew it was coming out beforehand, a lot of talk about it. A lot of opinions about the speech. Obviously, the best part of the speech was the Speaker of the House's faces and expressions behind the back of the President. If you didn't go back and watch it, just watch that. It's golden watching Speaker of the House Johnson's face during the speech. But this statement is a really big one because the U.S. has been providing assistance via airdrops. C-130s have been dropping meals ready to eat, MREs, into Gaza. However, because Israel has blockaded Gaza and has not allowed the free flow of food and supplies in, obviously the 2 million people in Gaza are suffering immensely, and the U.S. wants to improve the flow, and the way to do that is by shipping. The problem is Gaza itself does not have a port. We're going to take a look at that. Let's look at the DoD and the Department of Defense's statement on what they're about to undertake.
Now, to carry out this mission, the department is moving quickly to deploy its joint logistics over the shore capability to provide the expeditionary pier to enable the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. JLOTS is a unique capability maintained by the Department of Defense whereby U.S. Army and U.S. Navy forces are organized, trained, and equipped to conduct joint ship-to-shore operations where fixed port facilities are inadequate or unavailable. Simply put, they'll establish a temporary offshore maritime pier that allows for shipping vessels to transfer cargo to smaller vessels to transport and offload cargo to a temporary causeway for the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Now, we're in the process of identifying, sourcing, and in some cases preparing forces to deploy, but I can confirm that elements of the 7th Transportation Brigade Expeditionary out of Joint Base Langley Eustis in Virginia have been tasked to support. Importantly, there will be no U.S. forces on the ground in Gaza.
All right, so let's take a look at first the geography we're dealing with here. So this is the Gaza Strip that has been identified. And understand, Gaza itself doesn't have a port. There is a place called the Port of Gaza, but it's basically a fishing marina. It is not a seaport of any means. The major ports that provide Gaza are basically two. One up here, this is Ashdod in Israel, and then the other one they've used is Algeria over here in Egypt. Both of these are about 20 miles or so from Gaza. Now, the easiest way to supply Gaza is through those ports. This is what we're looking at here is one of the toughest ways to supply Gaza. First is by air, because that's ridiculously inefficient. And second, it's going to be over the beach. The best way to do this is to bring ships into Algeria in Egypt or into Ashdod into Israel and then drive the cargo into Gaza. However, there are issues with this, obviously. You need the permission of the Egyptians. You need the permission of the Israelis. And obviously that is not being done. So what the pier will do is bypass both the Egyptians and the Israelis, but not quite, as you're about to see. So this is a zoom in, and we're using basically a satellite map here to show you a little bit more on the specifics. So one of the things that stands out here is the gate, the fence around Gaza. You can see it here, but what I want to show you is the beach. And right here is the small port of Gaza. You'll see the very little cove right here. But again, this is designed for very small boats. There's almost no way to get any ships in there. It is just too small. And the rest of the Gaza Strip is basically just a beach. There's one little site here that has an outcropping, a bit of a jetty on it that sticks out that could potentially be used for something. But the rest of it is just flat, narrow beaches. And also very shallow, by the way, off the beach. So it's not like you can bring big ships right in off the coast. This entire strip here is basically the same. There's almost no descendable features, which means that whatever type of pier you put in here is going to be exposed to the weather. And while the Mediterranean, the southeastern part of the Mediterranean, is not a very rough part of the Mediterranean, it does get storms now and then. And we'll talk about that. And this is the border right here between Gaza and into Egypt. So we're already seeing that the European Union is beginning the delivery of food. This story over at G Captain, food aid loaded on a barge in Cyprus is heading for Gaza. You can see it loading on a barge. The barge is going to have to travel 210 miles from Cyprus to Gaza. It's a long voyage in open water, but it is done by barges all the time. Obviously, this could not be done in rough water. The question is going to be is how they're going to offload that barge once it gets to Gaza. Now, the reason it's coming out of Cyprus is because the Israelis are requiring that any cargo landing across the beach into Gaza be inspected by the Israelis. They want to make sure there's no entrance of weapons in there for Hamas. And so there are Israeli officers in place to do it. Now, what's going to happen is that this means that all cargo going into Gaza is going to have to be inspected at some point. That means it's going to have to go through Cyprus and then come down to the pier facility that's going to be set up in Gaza. So that's going to take time to set up, and it's going to be kind of a laborious operation. All right, let's look at what General Ryder talked about. Let's discuss what's called Joint Logistics Over the Sea, or JLOTS, as it's known. So JLOTS is not an amphibious invasion. You're not storming into Omaha Beach with Tom Hanks and Saving Private Ryan. This is D+1. This is the follow-up behind an amphibious assault where you would bring logistics in. The other way we use this, and it's been used a lot over the years in JLOTS, is ports that get damaged in storms. Probably the best example was 10 years ago down in Haiti, where ports are destroyed and you have to bring in a lot of relief and supplies. And so there are three components to a JLOTS operation. The first is the pier itself. As you see there, the floating causeway pier. So, the pier down there is going to be one of the key elements. You've got to set a pier up coming in off the beach, and we'll talk about the different style of piers that could be done. Second, you have a floating pier. This is further out to sea. Because it's shallow coming in, you can't bring big vessels. What's not going to happen on this pier that they're going to set up in Gaza is big ships will pull up alongside and offload. You're not going to get that because it's shallow and it's not the type of pier that's being put in. What you're going to have to do is have a floating pier, which is basically a series of barges anchored out off the coast. Ships will come in, offload onto the floating pier or onto what are called connectors. And that's the third part here is the connectors. The connectors go from the floating pier or ships at anchor to the causeway system. So you've got to have three elements to make a JLOTS work. The pier, the floating pier, and then the connectors that will bridge the system. So I listened to General Ryder's statement, and again, I have kind of background on this. Let me be clear about a couple of things. Number one, it doesn't appear that anything has moved yet. It sounds like now the execute order has been given, which means this is going to take time to set up. According to General Ryder, they're talking 60 days until this is set up. Now, I actually think they can do it before 60 days, but it's going to be a matter of moving the assets into place. Now, for the floating pier, there's a couple of options at play that the U.S. can do. One of them is using what's called an Expeditionary Support Dock, or an ESD. I'm sorry, this video is going to be full of military acronyms, and I'm going to try to use them as sparingly as I can. But the ESD, or the Expeditionary Support Dock, there are two of them. One's on the East Coast, one's on the West Coast. These are ships that are designed, they're basically modified oil tankers. And you'll see right here, they've been cut down in the middle to have a nice big flat deck. And what you can do is run Marine Corps LCACs, Landing Craft Air Cushion, or amphibious vessels up to them, and you can actually load cargo onto them. What the ESD basically is, it's that floating pier. And ships can come alongside using their ship's cranes, because the ESD doesn't have ship's cranes, and you can take the cargo, put it onto the deck of the ESD, move it around, and load it onto connectors to send it ashore. So that's one method that may be done. And again, we don't know for sure, because while General Ryder talked about this a lot, he's also an Air Force general, and he was in kind of a little bit outside his comfort zone in talking about this. The other thing you have is you set up the floating pier, and this is what you're seeing. You're looking from the stern ramp of a ship at a floating pier. And what a floating pier is basically a batch of causeway sections, or barges, that are joined together. The U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy have this version. The Navy version is called the Improved Logistics or Improved Naval Logistics System. The Army system that they use is very similar. What this actually is, and again, another acronym here, is an RRDF, a roll-on, roll-off discharge facility. It allows ships to put their ramps down, drive cargo onto the platform, and then you can move it onto the connectors. And what you see here is a U.S. Navy expeditionary fast vessel on the left side, and then two Navy, what are called side-loading warping tugs, keeping the position here. Now, this floating pier here is anchored. There are anchors that are out into the ocean that keeps it in place, and it allows ships to kind of come up alongside. And again, this can be the intermediary platform to take cargo off ships and put them into watercraft. You can also put a crane onto this facility to help offload ships that don't have cranes. So if you have cargo ships coming in, that you can basically move that cargo off a ship and put it onto a connector. Understand, they're talking about moving 1 million MREs a day. First off, I don't know how many MREs we have, let alone Muslim acceptable MREs, no pork, meet all the criteria for Islam. But you're going to burn through your MREs pretty quick doing this. I think what you're going to eventually see is basically grain, rice, basically bulk food items, bags of this stuff, containers of it come in. And so you're probably going to need a facility, a crane here. Now, the other option you may have is, I talked about the ESD, the Expeditionary Support Dock. We also have auxiliary crane ships. There are two on each coast. These are modified container ships which have huge, massive cranes. They can be used to offload smaller vessels and load it onto connector craft. So you have a variety of methods that are at play here. For the pier itself, there are two types of piers you can use. This is an elevated causeway system. This is basically a series of causeways, those barges I showed you, except they're jacked up. And you can see how they go onto the coast there. They're above. This gets you out of the surf line, which is a really good thing. This is a more permanent fixture than a floating one. The problem with this, as you heard General Ryder said, that there's going to be no DOD people on the beach. Well, to build this, you got to be on the beach, so there's no way around this. And what you basically do is you take these barges, they have these big jack legs, big huge metal tubes, and you hammer them into the bottom, about 6 of them on each of the barges, and then you jack the barges up. And what you get is this is that elevated causeway system. You actually cut the tops of the pipes off, and you get a nice elevated causeway system. And what you're seeing right here is you have a crane on here. You can bring trucks down here, load trucks with cargo. This is one of the integrated logistics, naval logistics system ships. These are the kind of the causeway ferries that can come out. You can put cargo on them, and they can move from the floating pier to the elevated causeway pier. Now, this is the longest one to build. It's more durable. This is the one I would think they would want to build because it's more of a permanent structure. It's not permanent per se, because this will not last long, especially when you start using it through a large amount of cargo on it. But it is definitely one that has a lot longer stay. The other type is this one, and this is the floating causeway system. This is basically taking those barges and you run them up on the beach. And then what you do, there's a series of anchors here. You can see the anchor chains coming off here into the surf, and you anchor them into position. The problem with this one is it is not as durable, and it has to be maintained. You can't just set it up and leave it alone. You've got to be constantly monitoring it, resetting anchors on it. It takes a lot to keep this system up and running. It is not something you just set up and walk away. You also got to have people ashore for it. So I'm not sure how the DoD is going to get away with this without having people on the beach. There's got to be an interaction here. Yeah, you can have some people maybe do it for you, but I'm telling you that to do this right and professionally, you're going to have to put people ashore. The other method that's used, and this is what was used down in Haiti actually back in 2014, was a barge was brought in with just a crane. This is just a pure commercial barge right here with a crane that was brought in. Now, this is a port, and let's be clear about this. This is the Port-au-Prince. So this is a port. It's not a beach. And so you had, for example, laydown area, the water depth was a little deeper here. Now, you didn't bring big, huge, massive boats up alongside of this. You still had to feed with connecting vessels the containers ashore, but if you look at the throughput that was done, it was pretty impressive. You're moving about 200 or so containers a day from the very beginning once this started. And once you start throwing in some more of these barges with cranes, you can see that the throughput went up quite substantially. They were moving over 1,000 containers at one point a day. So they were able to get some pretty good throughput. Again, it takes time to set it up. And I do think that a barge and crane method is definitely something that should be looked at, especially if you start talking about phasing out the role of the U.S. military in this operation. The other element you have are the connectors, and these are the ones that are going to bring the cargo from the ships to shore. Now, this is an example of a causeway ferry that doesn't use a shoreside pier. It basically just runs itself up onto the beach, and now you can offload it. And what you see there are containers, 20-foot containers up on the vessel, and they're using container handlers to move them on and off. Now, this is time-consuming. It's not very fast. It's not very quick, but you can definitely move it. You also have to prepare the beach. This is not just finding any piece of beach and running it up. Usually what you have to do is scale the beach, kind of get the beach set up so that you can bring these craft up so you're not basically going in the water as you see here. This craft is already coming up here onto a nice area, which means you're dredging, you're scraping the beach to kind of get the beach conforming, which again means you got to put military ashore to do that. This is probably the method that you'll see used initially. These are the causeway ferries, where you would start taking the containers onto the causeway ferries here. What you're looking at is an elevated causeway system. This is that elevated pier on the right. And then these causeway ferries right here are loading up with containers so that you can bring the containers on board and hoist the containers up. Again, it's a slow process, but if you're talking about throughput, if you're talking about moving 1 million MREs a day, you're going to need to be able to move, dozens, if not hundreds of containers to do that. And again, 1 million meals a day is great, but we're talking about a population of 2 million that needs 3 million meals a day. And not to mention the fact that we're starting this way late. I mean, it's just ridiculously how late we're starting this. I mean, I hope people can not be hungry for 2 months till this system gets up. But anyway, this is what they're talking about. And there's a lot involved, obviously, in this system. The other vessel they're talking about that was mentioned by General Ryder is this vessel. This is an LSV. This is a landing ship vehicle. And before you jump to a conclusion here, this is not a U.S. Navy vessel. This is a U.S. Army vessel. The U.S. Army has vessels manned by warrant officers, some of the best sailors out there. There are actually 8 of these in the U.S. Army, 8 LSVs. 5 of them are in Norfolk. 3 of them are stationed in Hawaii. And LSVs are fantastic platforms. Let me be clear. The Army and watercraft are synonymous. Go back to 1898 when the U.S. Army landed off of Daiquiri and Guantanamo during the Spanish-American War. It was the Army through the Army Transport Service that set this up. When the Military Sealift Command was created in 1949, it brought over the Army's large watercraft. This is their big ocean-going vessels. They brought them into the Navy. However, the Army connectors, their watercraft, remained with them. And LSVs are fantastic. Now, they're smaller than a World War II LST. They're more akin to an LCT or kind of a landing craft tank or an LSM, landing ship medium. The U.S. Marine Corps are talking about building vessels very much like this for their Marine littoral regiments. And General Ryder mentioned that these vessels would be used to ferry cargo potentially from Cyprus all the way to the dock in Gaza, which means you would not need that offshore floating pier. You may just need the pier in Gaza, which would be a big issue. I mean, if you can get rid of the floating pier, that's great. Then you can just go right to the pier in Gaza. And these ships can do it. The only issue with these ships are, number one, they're really slow. They are rated for 12 knots. They're not doing 12 knots. It's 5,500 miles from Norfolk to Gaza. They may be able to do a transatlantic passage at about 10 knots. You're still talking about 3 to 4 weeks to get these craft up and over there to do them. Now, once they're there, they'll be fantastic. You can load these up with containers. You can put bulk grain on board and run them onto the beach. They would be really good with that. They also are completely defenseless. There's no defenses on these vessels. And these ships can be used. They can either be run up to the causeway ferry, and you can actually design that causeway ferry so you can put the ramp down onto the causeway so that you can go onto either the elevated causeway or the floating causeway, or you'll have a crane to offload them. But LSVs are a great option. Now, some of these are in shipyards right now in Norfolk. At least one of them, if not two of them, are in a shipyard in Norfolk. One of them just got underway yesterday. It was sailing south out of Norfolk. Not sure where it's going yet. But, I mean, you can start seeing their movement happen pretty soon. They could also help carry the causeways over, although I think they're going to activate ships from the Military Sealift Command, either ships under charter to Military Sealift Command or from the Department of Transportation's Ready Reserve Force. These are the ships laid up in ports around the United States. They would load the causeway sections, all the elements of the elevated or floating causeway pier, and be able to sail it over. And here's a perfect example of an LSV coming into one of those floating piers. This is actually coming to what they call a trident configuration, where there are 3 prongs to the floating causeway pier right there, and you can see them coming in to offload cargo. And again, this is a way to deliver cargo. It is not fast. It is not going to deliver huge amounts of cargo in. But right now, over nothing coming in or airdrops coming out of C-130s, this is a big improvement coming in. And so my hesitation about this has to do with the fact that there are faster ways to get cargo in there, again, through those 2 ports, one in Egypt and one in Israel. Now, if you look at the history of these concepts, there are obviously 2 big ones that stand out. One, World War II. These are the mulberries. This is the mulberries that were set up off of the D-Day beaches. There were 2 of them set off, one off the American beach, one off the British beach. These were set up, and these were massive configurations. These were big, long piers, and you can see the piers out here. These are the piers actually set up. There are causeway sections that link you to the beach here so that you could actually bring deep draft vessels, Liberty ships, LSTs, whatever you needed, right up against them and offload them. But then you also created a breakwater out here, an area of enclosed water so that it would be common there should storms happen. This is something that's going to be lacking from the pier at Gaza. Gaza is a big, huge open strip of water. There's going to be no enclosure for it. And so if you're going to do a pier where you just run it up on the beach, once the weather comes in, it's going to go away. It's going to break away. You're going to have to tend it, and you're going to have to keep an eye on it. And even the elevated causeway would have problems with it. The other example here is not just the one we used during World War II, but during the Vietnam War. This is at Cam Ranh and Da Nang. The United States built 2 ports, and we used very much the same process. We used those causeways, that elevated causeway system, but a much bigger system that was used with what were big, huge floating platforms that we brought in, big enough so that you could actually bring cargo ships like this. These are C2s and Victory ships being brought in so that you can supply cargo into Cam Ranh and Da Nang during the Vietnam War. So we do have this capability. The capability resides with 2 different entities within the U.S. military, and those 2 different entities are really important to identify because we've seen that ability kind of lapse away. This is marine traffic. It shows you the disposition of the afloat prepositioning force and the U.S. Army's LSVs. And as I mentioned to you before, the LSVs, there are 3 of them here in Hawaii, and the other 5 are right here over in Norfolk. But then there are groupings of what are called afloat prepositioning ships. And they're kept largely in 2 areas. One of them is down in the Indian Ocean, down here at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And the other one is at Guam, Saipan, Tinian in the Western Pacific. And then another group are kept up here in Korea. And in truth, the one group that has done the best at this was the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps, after the situation that evolved with Iran in the late 70s, 1980s, the U.S. built and converted 13 what were called maritime prepositioning ships. They outfitted 3 squadrons. Each squadron could support a Marine Expeditionary Brigade of about 16,000 Marines for 30 days. And what was interesting about these 4 or 5-ship squadrons was you can bring them pier side and offload them in 3 days, or you can offload them offshore in 5 days because they had this causeway system on board. The problem is the Marine Corps have gotten away from this. In 2012, the squadron that was based in the Mediterranean in Europe was phased out. And after General Berger, the former commandant of the Marine Corps, introduced his new Marine Corps program, the 2030 program, he began to phase out the ships that were in the Marine Corps program. And what we see here is that even the 2 squadrons that remain right now, there's not much left of them. There's actually only a shell of the ships left. There are 3 of the ships kept in Diego Garcia and only 3 of them in and around the Western Pacific. Now, while the U.S. Army has an afloat prepositioning program too, they've had one for a long time. And matter of fact, they used to preposition watercraft, what they called a port opening package. They actually had connectors. They actually had the modular causeway sections. They phased that out. And now while they have ships afloat prepositioning in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, they don't have that causeway system. That's why that causeway system that the Army's going to have to use is going to come from Fort Eustis in Virginia. So General Ryder said there's still a lot of details to be worked out, which means he's not been briefed on them yet. I have a feeling that there were some heads up that was sent out about this, but not exactly the true scope and scale. 7th Transportation Group Expeditionary is a great unit, one of the top units in the U.S. Army. It's actually the most deployed unit in the U.S. Army. No one ever knows that. But the Transportation Corps does it all the time. 7th Trans, I worked with them for a long time when I was working for Military Sea Lift Command, are experts. I loved working with the 7th Transportation Group. They were always top-notch. The gear they had, they were just really good. And the Navy, with the Marine Corps side, the Naval Beach Groups, the Navy Amphibious Groups, the Seabees, they were all great. Everybody's great, but it sounds like this is going to be a U.S. Army mission. It sounds like it's going to be solely within 7th Transportation Group. They're going to task them to use it. They may send over some of their smaller landing craft utilities, the 2000s, but the LSVs are probably going to be the big connectors. And if you're running cargo from Cyprus over to Gaza, again, a little bit over 200 miles, the LSVs are a good choice for that. Now, I think over time, you'll be able to phase out the LSVs and use commercial vessels. Matter of fact, I'm not even sure if the LSVs are going to get there in time to be used in any sort of meaningful purpose. They're probably going to be deployed to make sure you get the photo up, but I think you can set up commercial vessels in the area and source them. The question is going to be who's going to take that job into Gaza, because the one issue that I haven't talked about that needs to be talked about is security. Who's going to provide security? Because the question is, while the Palestinians in Gaza are going to want the food aid, they're going to want the supplies, they're going to want this, will Hamas allow this to happen? Will Hamas target the elevated causeway, the floating pier? Will they target the floating pier that'll be off the coast? Will they target the vessels coming in? This is a big issue. This is not an issue to take very lightly. And I understand it was less than a 1-minute applause line that was done for the National Security Council. So, you know, the NSC can feel good about themselves getting an applaud line in. But this is a tough endeavor. It would be much easier to get the Israelis to allow shipments through Ashdod, to let the Egyptians through shipments through Algeria. But if you're going to go over the beach, this has issues with it. It is not easy. It's going to take a long time to do. We're talking about weeks, if not months, to set this up. It's going to be expensive. If anybody tells you this is not expensive, it is. You're going to be talking about chartering ships, sailing vessels, deploying. This is going to be millions of dollars to go ahead and get this up, let alone the food supply. And then there's the security issue, the risk. Because even though you heard General Ryder say they're not going to put American, boots on the ground, they're going to be right there. They're going to be on an elevated causeway or a floating causeway sitting there pier. They're going to be on a floating pier, maybe out off the coast. They're going to be on Army vessels coming in, or maybe MSC vessels, potentially Navy vessels. There's a lot of issues associated with this. We do not have all the information about this. This is me assessing the information that's been released by the President, by the DoD, Department of Defense, General Ryder, and what I've gotten from communications with people I know out there and what they're thinking we may see happening. So again, we don't know what's going to be deployed yet. We're watching. We're going to see if an ESD goes, an expeditionary support dock, a crane ship goes, who knows. But I would envision seeing probably the crane ship go, because they can carry a lot of the modules necessary, plus they have the cranes to offload them to deploy the floating cranes that will be used, or the LCAS, the elevated causeway, or the floating pier. A lot going on. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, you can hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Until our next video, or the next time the President announces the deployment of a floating causeway system, this is Sal signing off.